The brown quail, scientific name Synoicus ypsilophorus, is a small, plump, ground-dwelling bird native to mainland Australia, Tasmania, Papua New Guinea, some eastern Indonesian islands and Timor. It's also been introduced to New Zealand and Fiji. These little birds are surprisingly common even in suitable urban parkland, although they're cryptic and seldom noticed. Most of the footage you'll see here was shot in Sydney Park, which is surrounded by densely populated inner suburbs. They eat seeds, green shoots, small fruits, insects, worms and tiny frogs, pretty much anything they can swallow. They favour wet grasslands, shrublands, agricultural areas and freshwater wetlands, but they can turn up even in normally arid areas after heavy rainfall has led to fresh, dense undergrowth. And the species is capable of rapidly colonising closed forest, where they would not usually be found after hot wildfires have cleared forest canopy and a meadow-like regrowth of grasses and herbs has emerged. I captured these guys with a camera trap in the state forest north of Bateman's Bay a few months after this area was heavily burned in the 2019-20 wildfires. Brown quail form pairs in spring, when there's an extended breeding season with clutches of 6 or more eggs being laid in a shallow scraped nest on the ground lined with grass, usually concealed under a grassy tussock or bush. The female incubates the eggs for 3 weeks. The newly hatched chicks are precocious, but are supervised by both parents for a couple of weeks, with the male then taking on the caring role to allow the female to start on the next clutch of eggs. When danger threatens, brown quail prefer to hide or run rather than fly. They're preyed on by raptors like this brown goshawk, pythons, dingoes and feral cats and foxes, but predators have to be quick. If quail are forced to the air, they fly low rapidly and scatter in different directions, regrouping after the danger has passed. The brown quail enters the scientific catalogue of nature way back in 1792, when its scientific description by the great French naturalist Louis Bosc appeared in the Journal d'Histoire Naturelle, and thereby hangs a remarkable tale of science, nautical disaster and revolution. Now, it's an odd thing that a French scientist should have described the bird, and at such an early date. Since James Cook's first voyage to the Pacific in 1768 and following European settlement at Port Jackson in 1788, the vast majority of Australian natural history specimens making their way to Europe arrived in Britain and were eagerly described and named by English naturalists. The publication of a methodical description and an official, universally accepted scientific name in Latin is the all-important moment in the recognition of a species of animal or plant. Bosc's description of the brown quail took place during the chaos of the overthrow of France's Ancien regime. It's amazing to think of this small bird from the other side of the world being calmly described by men of science meeting and publishing in the midst of the turmoil and carnage of the French Revolution. So how did the first specimen reach Paris? Here's what I reckon happened. Let's wind back a few years. In 1785, French King Louis XVI appointed the Comte de la Perouse, a naval veteran of the 7 Years' War, to lead an expedition to the Pacific. It was all about trade opportunities, new territories, scientific observation, and the collection of plant and animal specimens. The expedition boasted at least a dozen scientists, including 2 scientifically qualified priests, and there were 3 illustrators. Now Bosc, who described the brown quail, had been a candidate for inclusion in the expedition, but his very close friend, the lovely Madame Roland, a natural history enthusiast who was to become an important player in the French Revolution, persuaded him not to go. Lucky him. The expedition departed in August 1785 with 2 ships. In December 1787 there was a clash with the inhabitants of Samoa, in which 12 men of the expedition were killed and 20 wounded. Licking its wounds, the expedition sailed on to Australia, arriving here at Botany Bay on the 24th of January 1788, where they found that the British First Fleet, sent out to colonise New South Wales, had arrived 6 days earlier. The British had already decided that Botany Bay wasn't a suitable place for settlement, and a couple of days later they sailed on up the coast to Port Jackson, leaving the French expedition camped here at what's now known as La Perouse until early March. The bush in this area is great brown quail habitat. In the 6 weeks they stayed at Botany Bay, the expedition's naturalists would have collected plant and animal specimens, and the illustrators would have busied themselves making drawings and watercolours of these. The French officers were on good terms with their English counterparts, and before the expedition returned to the Pacific, they entrusted them with letters, papers, and La Perouse's journal. And amongst those materials were, I reckon, either a skin of a brown quail or perhaps more likely a few notes and an accurate watercolour of the species. The expedition's papers were duly conveyed to England on a returning First Fleet vessel, which reached England on the 1st of June 1789 and were sent on to Paris. The French Revolution had just begun. Blissfully unaware of events in France, the expedition departed Botany Bay on 10 March 1788 and came to grief in a violent gale on the island of Vanikoro, but its fate wasn't established until 1825. No one survived to return to Europe. By 1791, back in revolutionary Paris, La Perouse's journal and other expedition records were being studied by the experts. Bosc did the new species of quail with its excellent illustration based either on a watercolour by an expedition artist or a skin prepared by a naturalist. But note this interesting detail. Where the locality the specimen was collected should be, there's just ellipses. My speculation is that, in the haste to transfer the expedition's material to the British, that detail was overlooked. In 1791, at the urging of Bosc and other French scientists, a further expedition was dispatched to Oceania to search for the missing La Perouse expedition. It was never found, but the searchers did collect another specimen of the brown quail in Tasmania. But owing to the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars, the expedition's scientific collections were seized by the British as spoils of war when the French ships reached Java. Fortunately, the expedition's naturalist, Jacques Labillardière, was a great friend of Sir Joseph Banks, who lobbied to have the collections returned to France. This specimen of the quail still resides in the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. The expedition's scientists and their illustrators perished at Vanikoro. Louis XVI went to the guillotine in January 1793, asking whether there was not, at least, any news of La Perouse. Madame Roland, for being a luminary of the moderate Girondin revolutionary faction, fell victim to the terror and was executed in November 1793. Before her execution, her memoirs, smuggled out of prison, were hidden by Bosc, who laid low in the forest of Montmorency, posing as a simple farmer. and spent his time researching forest spiders. He escaped the terror by sailing to the United States, where he initiated a systematic survey of the mushrooms of the southern states. You can't keep a good naturalist down. Eventually he returned to France, where he became the administrator of hospitals and prisons. Still doing natural history, he died with his boots off in 1828. If you liked this video, please hit that red subscribe button and then the bell icon, and you'll be notified of new Werrong Lane videos.